sometimes people worry about the employment effects of AI or whatever. The evidence so far is AI is not replacing people, it's replacing tasks. So it's not like an entire job is being done with AI. It's that workers are using AIs to help them with specific things they are already doing.
So no doubt AI is changing the way we all work, and there's a lot more changes to come. My guest today is Chad Syverson, and he's a productivity expert and a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. And he's really focused in his work on understanding organizational productivity and how it impacts our lives and businesses. And Chad says that AI has the power to turbocharge our global productivity. And that matters because if we're more productive, we have better business outcomes like improved financial results and reduced waste and even happier and more satisfied employees because, as he says, no one wants to work for an unproductive organization. Chad really helped me understand the implications of AI on global productivity and why it's going to be a key driver for the next few years and how our physical spaces can help. Here's my conversation with Chad. So Chad, welcome to Work Better.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be here.
I have to confess that sometimes when we get into conversations at work about productivity, like I can get a little uncomfortable sometimes, and maybe some of our listeners feel the same way. So I'm grateful for you coming to talk about it with us a little bit more. And I want to start just by saying it feels like productivity has been an issue we've been wrestling with for decades, really. And I'm curious, like, why do you feel it's important now? Or what do you think has changed about productivity that we should be thinking about?
First of all, just at a business level, productivity is associated with so many kind of desirable things. Profitability, higher pay for workers, lower quality adjusted prices for customers, faster growth for the business, survival for the business. So if you want to run a highly productive business and you want to work for a highly productive organization. That's kind of always been true. But, with the rate of technological progress that we might be coming to see in the next few years, I think productivity is just going to become all the more important as a thing to be thinking about and considering and just dealing with in terms of where it's going to move the business landscape.
Yeah, so I want to double click on what you said about it being, as an employee, you want to work for highly productive organizations because, sometimes I think productivity could be perceived as, hey, my leaders are just trying to ask me to do more with less, or they're trying to squeeze more out of me. So we might perceive it as being something that's negative, but you'd say that's not the case.
I think you're right, both in terms of my conclusion, but also I understand that folks out there sometimes have the perception you raised. Mm-hmm. But I could tell you what the data say, and that is, so first of all, the idea that you can raise productivity just by beating your employees harder and making them miserable, that might work for a month, might work for a couple of months.
Temporarily. Mm-hmm.
But that's not going to work forever. And we know that the productivity that really affects business outcomes is a persistent thing. It lasts years on end. Mm-hmm. And so the only way you get that is by having a well-functioning organization. And I bet a lot of your listeners, just through life experience, have worked for well-functioning organizations and maybe less well-functioning organizations.
Not so much, yeah.
And I would posit that they enjoyed working more at the well-functioning organizations. And those are the ones that tend to be productive. And that's why I say, if you're a worker, you want to be at a highly productive place. You're going to enjoy your job a lot more because, again, places that are productive over the long run aren't doing it by making their workers miserable. They're doing it by conducting the symphony of business, if I can be a little elaborate with a metaphor, in a way that makes it a symphony rather than a cacophony.
Chad, can we just double click on like what makes for a well-functioning organization versus a non-functioning organization?
That's a great question. Uh, Here's what the research literature says, and we actually know quite a bit about this, but there's been a lot of work done. A lot has to do with management practices, so it's definitely about what the manager is doing and/or some combination of elements of their personality and the way they interact with their workers. There are many specific things folks have looked at, but I think you could summarize a few of the big ones as being management has a feedback loop in place that it's tracking metrics tied to the production process. Mm-hmm. And when those metrics are lagging, it's trying to figure out why. And then it's taking steps to ameliorate the problems created because of those issues. And then hoping it to have fixed the problem, continues to track the metrics and see if they've gotten back on track. And if not, you do it again and again. And you do that for every single process, and you pay more attention to more important processes, but you're basically through the entire organization, you've got this feedback loop of what are we trying to accomplish here? What are the numbers saying about that? If we don't think we're accomplishing what we ought to, where are the problems coming from? And how can I work either through adjusting the process or helping my employees or some combination thereof try to bring this process back on track and get the metrics back to where we'd like them to be. And then you do that over and over again. You never stop. And then you're always also trying to continuously improve them. Mm-hmm. So it's like, well, we can do this well when we're functioning at 100% these days, but it'd be great by next year if we could be 2% better. Is there a way I can rearrange things, so to speak, to get that extra 2% without making my employees more miserable? So how can I coordinate the actions of the organization, work with them to try to get that extra 2% out or whatever over the next couple of years, and you do that through the feedback loop as well. So that seems to be a big part of what good managers do.
So if I'm in a leadership role and I'm not really interested in getting feedback, that may be a challenge for us to be functioning as well as we could be, right?
Yeah, good managers are not the ones who come up with dictates, throw them over the transom, and just expect things to happen by themselves. There's definitely an interactive component, both with the process and the workers too. A good manager is very good at evaluating their workers and trying to assign workers to where they're the most effective in the organization.
Yeah. It's a point well made that we all actually feel good when we're working on something and we feel a sense of accomplishment, and we feel like we're actually getting things done. Like I think people get a lot of value, personal value from feeling that. So looking at productivity trends, like backing out a little bit, there's been a lot that's been in the news about kind of what's happening with productivity. And you say like we've been going through a period where productivity has been declining or maybe not growing as fast as it might have at different time periods. And I was wondering if you could break that down a little bit, like what you think on a macro level is happening with productivity from a lot of different organizations together.
Sure. Just to give some background. So if you look at average productivity growth in the U.S. economy since World War II, okay, so 1945, there's basically been four periods. One was late 1940s to early 70s. Mm-hmm. Those 25-ish, 30 years were high productivity growth periods. Lots of technical change, lots of increases in productivity at a bunch of businesses across the board.
That was kind of post-World War II.
Yeah, so that was the post-boom, exactly.
Yeah.
And then in 73, 74, and it is pretty sharp, it's right one of those 2 years, productivity growth slowed down a lot. Now, it kept growing. It wasn't that productivity levels fell, but it stopped growing as quickly. Mm-hmm. And it grew slowly for 20 years after that, into the mid-90s. And then it reaccelerated 1995 to around 2005. That's the third period. And then since then, it slowed down again. And the issue now is if you squint, it was really slow '05 to the mid 2000s, very slowly started rising. And then since in the past 2 years or so, it's been reasonably fast. Not quite, the late 90s boom fast, but it seems to accelerate it. And so the question is, I think, on a lot of economists' minds, are we out of that fourth period, that second slowdown, and into a new reacceleration or not? I mean, and time will tell. And there's reasons why you might think we're going to exit from that low productivity growth period. But again, it's not quite clear yet.
Are those periods where it's going up, I mean, is that associated with something like a new emerging technology or some other force that's kind of happening that's causing us to be more productive than maybe we were at another time?
So often, historically, you do see these decade-plus long productivity accelerations being associated with an identifiable technology. An economist would say, general purpose technology. This is not just something applicable for a particular line of business, but that something that can be applied to a whole bunch of stuff.
Right.
And so I think the evidence is pretty clear, for example, that 95 to '05 boom was basically the IT revolution hitting. Now, it's interesting, we had computers before 1995.
Sure.
And in fact, there were people saying, well, why aren't the computers moving? We were in this productivity slowdown since the early 70s. We've got all these computers. Why are we seeing the productivity benefits? There's often a gap between when you can sort of identify the technology and when you actually see its productivity effects hit.
Yeah, when it actually begins to change the ways that we're working and
exactly.
Yeah.
And because these things take longer to diffuse than I think a lot of their proponents.
Yeah.
And I think kind of where this is leading is like what's going to go on with AI. Is AI the next general purpose technology? Are we going to see a productivity boom from that? And that's kind of the open question right now.
Well, you anticipated my next question, so let's talk about that because I think, of course, everybody's thinking about AI. It's being adopted more quickly by some organizations than others. We see a lot that's suggesting that employees are adopting AI even faster than what their organizations have kind of figured out their AI strategy. So can you just talk about that a little bit, about how you think AI might begin to change our productivity levels?
Sure. So the first question is AI a general purpose technology? Is it something that's very line of business specific, or can we imagine it being used across a whole bunch of different business functions? Mm-hmm. And I think that latter argument's pretty easy to make. Basically, AIs are a giant prediction machine, and the applications of prediction are numerous and broad, right? So you can see this thing potentially having use all over. So I think it checks that box. The next question is, can that prediction ability be harnessed in a way that's useful for doing work? I think we have some evidence that that's true right now for kind of writing, maybe the more rote end of things. That seems to be pretty good at that. Seems to be good at writing code, especially if you already know how to code a little bit. You can use it to help you write more code. So we're starting to see specific applications. The full extent of its application, though, I think it still remains to be seen. Again, I think the potential is there. People could tell stories, but we're just really on the leading edge now, I think, of actual application in work environments. And so it's kind of a question of how far are those going to go? And then two, a thing we've seen historically with other general purpose technologies is one of their productivity benefits comes just from they replace something that they're better than before. So a classic example, the electric motor. It was better than a steam engine, better than a water wheel at running a manufacturing plant. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you get some productivity benefit of just getting rid of that water wheel, putting in electric motor. But the biggest productivity benefits of, in that example, electrification and manufacturing was you didn't need to design a factory the way you used to. They used to have to stack up a factory next to the river, and you had to have all the machines run off that water wheel. Once you have electric motors, You can put a little motor on every single machine, and now you can flatten the factory. You can completely reconfigure the physical layout of how stuff is made, how workers work and interact with one another. And so it's really that second wave of things you couldn't have imagined even doing with the old tech. You're not just replacing the old technology doing the same thing. You're doing things the old technology wouldn't have even allowed.
Right.
That's a big part of productivity growth that lasts for a decade or more from a general purpose technology. I mean, it's just too early to really know what those completely different things are for AI.
Yeah.
People have some ideas, but we're not actually seeing, I think, yet examples of them. We may well, could be in the next few years, we're going to start seeing that. But yeah. I think that's still a very open issue in terms of how big the eventual productivity effects of AI are going to be.
Yeah. To your point, it's changing so rapidly. I mean, before chatbots even got introduced, it just feels like in that brief period of time where it became mainstream conversation, in living rooms around the world that we're all talking about how we're using it, like it has already changed so dramatically. And of course, it feels like when we're talking about AI, we're all kind of really zoomed in on like chatbots as kind of a function or maybe creating an agent. But to your point, I think there's just so many different uses that we haven't even begun to understand. So when you think in that way, that there's things that are going to happen that we can't even imagine at this point. Do you have advice for leaders in organizations and businesses to say, like, how might I have to think differently to take advantage of what you're calling a general purpose technology? How do we embrace that?
I think one big thing is just be a good listener. Listen to your colleagues, listen to your workers, like how is what they are doing being currently affected by AI? I mean, one thing, sometimes people worry about the employment effects of AI or whatever. The evidence so far is AI is not replacing people, it's replacing tasks. Mm-hmm. So it's not like an entire job is being done with AI. It's that workers are using AIs to help them with specific things they are already doing. Well, it's kind of a manager's job to stay on top of like, okay, where are they getting the usefulness out of this tool with? How can I enhance that? How can I expand the set of things that they are able to do better because of AI? And so that's that's listening to them, that's listening to your colleagues in other divisions, maybe at other companies, how they are dealing with this new technology. A little creativity, a little experimentation is never a bad thing with a new technology. Maybe you get some idea or some idea bubbles up from your organization. Hey, why don't we try doing this with this new thing? We hadn't thought of that before, but now that we're using them, maybe we could give it a shot. Not everything is going to work out after the fact, but you learn from those failures as well. And so I think it's just, do you have to know the inner technical workings of how large language models work to know how to harness them? No, probably not. But you do kind of have to understand how the particular production process where you're working, whether you're making a product, a good or a service or whatever, how that interacts with the way AI can be used to be doing all the steps that go into making your product. So just being cognizant of the interactions between the process and what AI can do.
Another area I wanted to ask you about in terms of productivity is one that I'm thinking about a lot, is kind of huge demographic shifts that are starting to go on in terms of, the world's population is aging pretty rapidly. If you look at the number of people who are over 60, that's going to be like doubling in the next couple of years around the world. And I'm curious about how that might play a role in terms of productivity as organizations are having right now more multi-generational workforces. You don't have people of just one age demographic that are working. It feels like that's really extending. And it could be a boost to productivity, maybe, or not. What do you think?
It's a great question. Let me tell you what the research shows about some of that stuff. So one is there's a little bit of a It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks kind of thing. So you do see adoption of technologies can be slower with workers who are more used to working with legacy technologies. That's, again, a function of a manager to try to smooth out that process. But that's an issue.
Right.
You do tend to see, in terms of the direct relationships between like the age, demographics and productivity growth, you actually see a little more business formation when the bulk of the population is not really young, but kind of, the 30 to 35 or 30 to 45 age group. They tend to create a lot of new businesses and do try a lot of new things. So that we sort of know is correlated with productivity growth, at least on sort of a big picture average level. But in terms of inside an organization, when you're dealing with folks from different generations who are used to doing things different ways. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is I'm 52, so 30 is young to me now. But
I'm not saying my age, but keep going.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't implying you should, but I'll say I'm 52. So I think of 30 is young, but 30-year-olds haven't been using AI their whole lives either. The young people, it's new to them too. So there's a bunch of we're far from the place where there's a generation out there who grew up with AI or something like that. Everyone's going to be trying to deal with AI together as a new thing for the next decade. I think that's fair to say. So I think from a management perspective, it's just like, people have built up human capital. They have experience. They've learned stuff through working. Some of what they've learned is tied to a particular technology. And if that technology gets replaced or augmented by something, they have to be able to deal with that. And again, I would just say from a management standpoint, you want to be there to help facilitate that learning process.
For sure, because, there are obviously different kinds of intelligences, if you will, that we have at different life stages, so there might be a lot of experience and intuitive knowledge that you're going to have to figure out how that new technology incorporates with that.
Precisely.
I would say, one of the things that I've discovered is AI as a research assistant, which I hadn't envisioned a couple years ago, but I'm like, hey, I can make this thing go out and search for all these scholarly articles and skim them for me and can save a whole bunch of time, which I'm finding a great value to my productivity.
Great example.
Yeah. So I want to shift before I let you go, Chad, and just talk about something that we always want to ask our guests their thoughts on this one, because, when we think about working better, we always think about our environments from a spatial perspective. Like, are there things that we can be doing to think about how we can help people to be more productive or just to work better in general? And I'm curious if you have thoughts about that from your perspective.
So actually there's some work, and I wish I knew it better, but I know this research literature exists about the actual spatial configuration of people in a workplace and how that affects how they learn and how productive they are. I'll just say from my own personal experience, so I'm at the University of Chicago, so of course as a professor I teach, but the University of Chicago is a research university. So actually most of my job is to do research. And that means I got to come up with ideas. And where I get a lot of my ideas? From talking with my colleagues and talking with my colleagues in the hallways. And our building was literally designed to make us accidentally run into each other when we're moving around, because people recognize that the idea generation process is often the serendipitous outcome of a couple professors running into each other saying, hey, did you see such and such a paper? Oh, yeah, I was thinking this and that. What do you, and boom, okay, let's go back to my office and work it out on the whiteboard. So, I know from personal experience how much the literal physical configuration matters. And that's why, for us anyway, we like to be in the office a lot, because that's where a lot of our ideas come from. And our doors are open and we interact a lot that way. Different people have different ways of doing things and different processes have different needs too. So it doesn't mean everyone's got to be bumping into each other all the time. But we do know, just as a straightforward implication, what you were saying is that spatial configurations do matter in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
People other than I have done very careful work on, the person next to you matters the most, the person beyond them matters X percent as much as the person next to you, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's so interesting how our thinking has evolved. It used to be more like offices were designed more like a factory kind of model where it was this belief that, work literally progressed from kind of point A to point B, like an assembly line of knowledge workers. And now we've learned so much more about, like, as you say, about the advantages of those interactions, those chance interactions, but also that need to be able to step into your own office and do some of your own thinking when you need to, kind of ebb back and forth between the two.
Right. It's task specific. Some things are better with a lot of interaction, and sometimes you need some time to yourself to finish something off or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Chad, I have to say it's been pleasant talking to you today. I am not as fearful about talking about productivity as I might have been when we kicked things off. So I really appreciate you sharing some of your research and the things that you're learning, particularly how AI might play a role going forward. So thank you for being here today.
You're welcome. That's kind of you to say, and I've really enjoyed it.
Crafting a vibrant workplace community means designing spaces that invite connection and collaboration while offering sanctuaries for solitude and centering. Learn more about the latest products created to help your team create community and work better at steelcase.com/new.
Organizational productivity is a heady topic, but if AI can help us and our organizations to work better, that's going to lead to more profitable companies and ultimately happier, more satisfied employees. If you liked this conversation today, check out an earlier conversation I had with Sean Gallagher called Onboarding Your AI Coworker. That's Season 5, Episode 6. And Sean really helps us to understand how leaders can use AI now, even if all the kinks haven't been worked out. Next week, we're going to be talking about our love-hate relationships with meetings. Author Stephen Rogelberg talks to me about why so many of our meetings are still pretty bad. And if you've ever asked, could this meeting be an email? You won't want to miss this episode. So don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and visit us at steelcase.com/research to sign up for our weekly updates on workplace research insights and design ideas delivered right to your inbox. Thanks again for being here, and we hope your day at work tomorrow is just a little bit better. Thanks to everyone who helps make Work Better podcast possible, including our producers Katie Pace, Rebecca Charbauski, Stav Kontis, Chiara Licari, Brandon Lacic, and Celeste Johnson. Creative art direction is by Erin Ellison and Emily Cowdrey. Our editing and sound mixing is by Soundpost Studios. Technical support is by Mark Caswell and Jose Jimenez. And our digital publishing is by Areli, Arellano, and Jordan Marks.